Here is a thought experiment. Tonight, at midnight, every African migrant in South Africa vanishes. Every Zimbabwean, every Mozambican, every Somali, every Ethiopian, every Nigerian, every Congolese. Shops closed. Workers gone. Families disappeared. Now, the morning after, does unemployment fall? Does crime stop? Do townships become safer? Does the housing crisis resolve itself? Does the healthcare system suddenly work? The anti-migrant politician says, yes, remove the foreigners. Problem solved. Today we test that claim. We apply real economics, real data, real evidence, to a very simple question. If all African migrants left South Africa tomorrow, would the problems actually disappear? The answer will surprise you. It will definitely surprise anyone who believes the anti-migrant narrative, and it will reveal something important about who actually benefits from keeping people divided. This is Griot Wave Academy, the African Civilization series. This is the empirical rebuttal episode, taking the political claim, migrants cause our problems, and subjecting it to rigorous economic analysis. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Before we move forward, I want to pause the political arguments, the headlines, and the emotions, and do something much simpler. Let us run a thought experiment. This is the same method economists, policy analysts, and scientists use when they want to test a claim. If we believe one factor is causing a problem, we remove that factor and observe what changes. In this case, the claim is straightforward. Migrants are causing South Africa's major social and economic problems. So let us ask a simple question. What would happen if every migrant disappeared tomorrow? First, the unemployment test. If migrants are the cause of unemployment, then their departure should create jobs. But would factories reopen? Would new industries appear? Would investment increase? Or would the structural problems, deindustrialization, energy insecurity, weak economic growth, and skills mismatches, remain exactly where they were? Second, the crime test. If migrants are responsible for crime rates should fall dramatically once they are gone. But what do crime statistics, gang dynamics, policing capacity, and organized criminal networks actually tell us? Are migrants the driver, or are they being used as the explanation? Third, the economic collapse test asks a different question. What disappears with migrants? Spaza shops, transport services, construction labor, cross-border trade networks, restaurants, supply chains, and thousands of small businesses. What are the economic consequences of removing those contributions overnight? Fourth, the structural causes test. Which problems are rooted in housing shortages, education inequality, corruption, weak governance, and historic exclusion? Would removing migrants solve those causes, or simply leave them untouched? Finally, the morning after scenario. Imagine day 1, week 1, month 1, and year 1 of a migrant-free South Africa. What has actually improved? What has remained unchanged? The purpose of this exercise is not to defend or attack migration. It is to separate cause from correlation, evidence from assumption, and policy reality from political rhetoric. If the problems remain after the migrants are gone, then migrants were never the cause. They were the distraction. This slide lays out the roadmap for the thought experiment. Rather than arguing emotionally for or against migration, we are going to test the anti-migrant claim the same way a researcher would test any hypothesis, by examining evidence, isolating variables, and following the data wherever it leads. The first question is foundational. Who are the migrants? Public debates often talk about migrants as if they are a single, anonymous mass. But before we can evaluate claims about their impact, we need to understand the actual demographics, numbers, occupations, and economic roles of migrant communities. You cannot analyze a phenomenon you have not first defined. The second test is the labor market test. This is perhaps the most common claim. Migrants are taking jobs. If that claim is true, then removing migrants should create employment opportunities for citizens. We will examine what labor economics, business ownership patterns, and employment data actually reveal. The third test focuses on crime and safety. Political rhetoric often links migration to criminality, but are migrants disproportionately responsible for crime, or has the relationship been overstated? We will compare perception with documented evidence and examine what crime statistics tell us. The fourth test asks a less common but equally important question. What disappears when migrants leave? Economies are interconnected systems. Businesses, supply chains, services, skills, and consumer spending all contribute to economic activity. If migrants vanished overnight, what would be lost alongside them? Finally, we arrive at the most important question of all: what would actually fix the problems? Even if migration were removed from the equation entirely, would unemployment, housing shortages, weak service delivery, corruption, educational inequality, and economic stagnation disappear? Or would the structural causes remain? By the end of these 5 tests, the objective is not to win an argument. The objective is to determine whether migration is truly the cause of the problems being discussed, or whether it has become a convenient explanation for challenges whose roots lie elsewhere. Evidence, not emotion, will guide the answer. Before we can test any claim about migration, we need to answer a basic question: who are we actually talking about? One of the biggest problems in public debate is that the word migrant is often used as if it describes a single, uniform group. It does not. Behind that label are workers, entrepreneurs, refugees, students, professionals, traders, families, and people seeking safety or opportunity. They come from different countries, different economic backgrounds, and different legal circumstances. Political rhetoric often treats migrants as an abstract threat. Political science requires us to replace abstraction with evidence. This chapter begins by establishing the facts. How many migrants actually live in South Africa? Where do they come from? What percentage of the population do they represent? Which sectors of the economy do they work in? What businesses do they own? What taxes do they pay? What services do they use? Most importantly, what is their actual economic footprint? These questions matter because public perception and statistical reality are often very different things. In many countries around the world, citizens routinely overestimate migrant populations by 2, 3, or even 4 times the actual figure. Fear grows most easily when numbers are unknown. We also need to distinguish between different categories. A refugee fleeing conflict is not the same as a skilled professional. A student is not the same as a cross-border trader. An undocumented migrant is not the same as a permanent resident. Lumping everyone together creates confusion and makes meaningful policy discussion impossible. Think of this chapter as establishing the baseline before the experiment begins. If we are going to ask whether migrants cause unemployment, crime, housing shortages, or economic pressure, we first need an accurate picture of who migrants are and what role they play in society. Good analysis begins with definition. Before we evaluate the claim, we must understand the people being blamed. Only then can we separate perception from reality and rhetoric from evidence. Before we begin testing claims about migrants and their impact, we need to establish a crucial fact. Migrants are not an overwhelming majority, nor are they a mysterious, undefined population. According to available estimates, foreign nationals make up roughly 2.9 million people in South Africa, about 4.9% of the population. In other words, more than 95% of the people living in South Africa are South African citizens. That statistic alone should make us pause. If migrants are less than 5% of the population, can they realistically be the primary cause of unemployment, crime, housing shortages, service delivery failures, and economic stagnation affecting a nation of over 60 million people? That is the question this chapter seeks to examine. The second point is diversity. There is no single migrant community. Zimbabweans are heavily represented in construction, domestic work, healthcare, education, and skilled professions. Mozambicans have a long history of labor migration tied to agriculture and mining. Basotho workers have crossed borders for employment for more than a century. Somali entrepreneurs are known for operating small retail businesses, often in areas abandoned by larger commercial chains. Nigerians, Ethiopians, Malawians, Zambians, Congolese, and others contribute through trade, professional services, education, transport, and entrepreneurship. Notice what this picture reveals. Migrants are not concentrated in one sector, one occupation, or one economic role. They are woven into the everyday functioning of the economy. It is also important to recognize that migration itself is not unusual. Southern Africa has experienced labor migration for well over a century. Many of these economic connections existed before modern national borders were drawn. The key lesson from this slide is simple. Before asking what would happen if migrants disappeared, we must first understand who they are. The data shows a relatively small, highly diverse population performing a wide range of economic functions. Any serious discussion must begin with those facts, not assumptions, rumors, or political slogans. Now that we know who the migrants are, we need to ask a second question. What do they contribute before we imagine removing them? One of the weaknesses in many migration debates is that people focus only on perceived costs while ignoring economic contributions. Every worker, entrepreneur, trader, taxpayer, and consumer is part of an economic system. If we remove millions of people from that system, we must account for what disappears alongside them. Look at the scale of the footprint. Somali-owned spaza shops alone form one of the largest informal retail networks in South Africa, serving millions of township residents every day. These businesses are not isolated enterprises. They support wholesalers, transport operators, packers, security guards, drivers, landlords, and countless South African workers throughout the supply chain. The same pattern appears across the economy. Migrant workers contribute billions in VAT, income tax, municipal payments, and indirect taxation through everyday spending. Whether documented or undocumented, people who buy food, rent property, use transport, and purchase goods generate economic activity that supports the broader system. Agriculture and mining provide another example. Large sectors of the economy rely on migrant labor, particularly in difficult, low-paid, and seasonal work. The question is not whether South Africans can perform these jobs. The question is whether those positions would be filled at the same scale, cost, and speed if migrant labor disappeared overnight. Healthcare tells a similar story. Foreign-trained doctors, nurses, caregivers, and health professionals help fill critical shortages, particularly in rural communities and underserved facilities where staffing gaps already exist. The purpose of this slide is not to argue that migration has no challenges. Every migration system creates pressures that require management. The point is simpler. Before discussing removal, we must understand contribution. A serious thought experiment requires a full balance sheet. If migrants vanished tomorrow, we would not simply remove people. We would remove businesses, labor, tax revenue, services, skills, consumption, and entire economic networks. The question is whether the benefits of removal would outweigh those losses. That is the test we are about to examine. This is the moment where the thought experiment becomes concrete. For the sake of analysis, imagine that at midnight, every migrant in South Africa disappears. Not next year, not gradually. Instantly. Every worker, entrepreneur, trader, driver, doctor, farm laborer, shop owner, and service provider is gone. What changes by morning? The first thing to notice is that nothing about unemployment, corruption, failing municipalities, electricity shortages, housing backlogs, or state inefficiency disappears overnight. The structural problems remain exactly where they were. What changes immediately is economic functionality. Within the first few hours, thousands of small businesses cannot open. Night shift workers vanish. Security posts go unmanned. Cleaning services, logistics operations, agricultural preparation, and parts of the healthcare system experience immediate disruption. By midday, township residents begin encountering a different reality. Many communities that depend on local informal retail networks find essential services unavailable. Bread, cooking oil, airtime, electricity tokens, and other daily necessities become harder to access. The disappearance of migrants also means the disappearance of businesses. By day one, the consequences spread beyond migrants themselves. South African workers employed in migrant-owned enterprises lose jobs. Farms struggle to harvest. Construction projects slow. Rural clinics and hospitals experience staffing shortages. By week one, supply chains begin to feel the shock. Agricultural losses accumulate. Retail distribution is disrupted. Export schedules are affected. The economic effects are no longer local. They are national. By month one, inflationary pressures begin to emerge. Reduced production means higher prices. Reduced labor availability means lower output. Reduced business activity means lower tax revenue. The economy becomes smaller, not stronger. The purpose of this exercise is not to argue that migration creates no challenges. The purpose is to test a specific claim. If migrants are the primary cause of South Africa's problems, their disappearance should produce immediate improvement. Instead, this scenario suggests that many existing problems remain, while new economic disruptions are created. That observation leads us to the next question. If removing migrants does not remove the crisis, what is actually causing it? We now arrive at perhaps the most common argument in every anti-migrant campaign. Migrants are taking our jobs. It is a powerful claim because unemployment is real. South Africa faces one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, particularly among young people. When people cannot find work, the search for an explanation is understandable. The question is whether migrants are actually the cause. This chapter applies a simple economic test. If migrants are taking jobs from South Africans, then removing migrants should create jobs for South Africans. The relationship should be direct and measurable. Fewer migrants should mean lower unemployment, but labor markets do not work that simply. Economists distinguish between job competition and job creation. Some migrants compete for jobs, but many also create jobs as entrepreneurs, employers, consumers, taxpayers, and participants in supply chains. A migrant-owned business may employ South Africans. A migrant worker may support industries that would otherwise struggle to operate. A migrant consumer creates demand that sustains local businesses. We must also ask a harder question. If every migrant worker disappeared tomorrow, would employers automatically replace them with South Africans? At the same wage? In the same location? With the same skills? The answer is not always obvious. More importantly, we need to examine the structural drivers of unemployment. South Africa's unemployment crisis did not begin with migration. It is linked to deindustrialization, energy shortages, weak economic growth, educational inequality, spatial segregation, skills mismatches, and policy failures that have accumulated over decades. This chapter is therefore not about defending migration or dismissing the frustrations of unemployed citizens. It is about testing a specific claim against economic evidence. If migrants are truly the primary cause of unemployment, the data should show it. If removing migrants would significantly reduce joblessness, the evidence should support that conclusion. But if unemployment remains rooted in deeper structural problems, then blaming migrants may provide a convenient explanation, while distracting attention from the policies and institutions that actually determine whether jobs are created. That is the question we will now investigate, not with slogans, but with economics. This slide examines one of the most intuitive and most frequently repeated assumptions in migration debates. If migrant workers leave, their jobs automatically become available to South Africans. At first glance, that sounds logical. If one worker leaves, another worker takes their place. But labor economics tells us the reality is far more complex. The first issue is skill and location mismatch. Jobs do not exist in the abstract. They exist in specific industries, at specific wage levels, and in specific locations. A farm in Limpopo, a mine in Rustenburg, or a remote agricultural operation in the Western Cape cannot simply be filled by an unemployed person living hundreds of kilometers away. Geography matters. Skills matter. Mobility matters. The second issue is willingness to work asymmetry. Many migrant workers accept jobs that are physically demanding, seasonal, uncertain, or low-paying, because their economic alternatives are different. This is not a judgment about anyone's character. It is a reality of labor markets. The question is not whether South Africans can do these jobs, but whether enough workers would accept them under the same conditions. Third, there is the issue of capital. Many migrant entrepreneurs do not simply occupy economic space. They create it. Through family networks, rotating credit systems, and informal financing structures, they establish businesses that might not otherwise exist. Removing the entrepreneur removes the enterprise itself, not just the individual operating it. Perhaps most importantly, unemployment is fundamentally a demand problem, not simply a labor supply problem. South Africa's challenge is not a shortage of people willing to work. It is a shortage of businesses creating enough jobs. Removing workers does not automatically create employers. The final point is that many migrant and local workers are complementary, rather than directly competing. They often perform different roles within the same economic chain. One job exists because another job exists. The lesson from this first test is clear. Labor markets are not musical chairs. Removing migrant workers does not automatically create equivalent opportunities for local workers. The relationship between migration and employment is more complex than simple replacement, and any serious policy must account for that complexity. We have now moved from theory to evidence. If the claim is that migrants are causing unemployment, then we should be able to observe what happens when migrant workers disappear. This slide brings together research from universities, international institutions, and real-world case studies to test that claim. The first thing to notice is the distribution of labor across sectors. Migrants are concentrated in industries such as agriculture, construction, domestic work, mining, informal retail, and parts of healthcare. But concentration does not automatically mean displacement. The key question is whether removing migrant workers results in measurable employment gains for South Africans. The evidence consistently suggests it does not. Consider Operation Dujula and similar campaigns. Hundreds of migrant-linked businesses were disrupted or closed. If the labor substitution theory were correct, local unemployment should have fallen as those jobs became available. Yet studies found no significant employment gains. Empty shops did not automatically become thriving South African-owned enterprises. The same pattern appears after episodes of xenophobic violence. Researchers examining affected communities found little evidence that displacing migrants created lasting employment opportunities for local residents. The underlying economic conditions remained unchanged. Agriculture provides perhaps the clearest example. During periods when cross-border labor movement was restricted, farms often struggled to recruit sufficient replacement workers. In some cases, crops were left unharvested and production losses followed. The jobs existed, but labor substitution did not occur at the scale predicted. The broader academic literature reaches a similar conclusion. Reviews by organizations such as the Academy of Science of South Africa, the International Labour Organization, and migration researchers consistently find no convincing evidence that migrant presence is a major driver of South African unemployment. This does not mean competition never occurs. In some sectors and locations, there can be labor market pressure. But that is very different from claiming migrants are the primary cause of mass unemployment. The lesson from this evidence is straightforward. Unemployment is largely a structural problem rooted in economic growth, investment, education, industrial policy, and labor demand. Removing migrants may change who occupy certain jobs, but it does not create the millions of new jobs South Africa needs. The data points to a difficult conclusion. The unemployment crisis existed before migrants, and it would remain after them. Up to this point, we have asked whether migrants are responsible for South Africa's unemployment crisis. The evidence has repeatedly pointed in the same direction. No, that does not mean unemployment is not real. It means we need to look at the actual causes. The pie chart tells an important story. The largest drivers of unemployment are structural, not demographic. Deindustrialization, educational inequality, infrastructure failure, labor market rigidities, low investment, and the enduring geography of apartheid explain the overwhelming majority of the problem. Migrant competition, where it exists, represents only a small fraction of the overall picture. Consider deindustrialization. South Africa once had a much larger manufacturing base. As factories closed and production declined, hundreds of thousands of middle-skill jobs disappeared. Those jobs were not lost to migrants. They were lost to economic restructuring, global competition, automation, and policy failures. Education is another critical factor. The PIRLS literacy studies consistently show severe reading and learning challenges among many learners. A modern economy cannot create high-skilled employment opportunities if large numbers of students leave school without foundational literacy and numeracy skills. Migrants did not design the education system. They inherited its consequences alongside everyone else. Infrastructure failure tells a similar story. Load shedding, unreliable transport systems, municipal dysfunction and service delivery breakdowns discourage investment and slow business expansion. Companies do not hire when they cannot reliably produce, transport, or sell their goods. Then there is the spatial legacy of apartheid. Millions of South Africans still live far from economic opportunity. Long commutes increase costs, reduce access to jobs, and make employment economically difficult even when vacancies exist. The map created under apartheid continues to shape labor market outcomes today. The central lesson is straightforward. Unemployment is primarily a structural problem, requiring structural solutions. Industrial policy, educational reform, infrastructure investment, spatial integration, and economic growth create jobs. Deportations do not. If we misdiagnose the cause, we will prescribe the wrong solution. And a country that spends its energy fighting symptoms instead of causes risks remaining trapped in the same crisis for another generation. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. We now arrive at the second major claim in the migration debate. Migrants are responsible for crime. Unlike the employment argument, this claim is often driven less by economics and more by fear. Crime affects people's daily lives. It creates anxiety, insecurity, and frustration. When communities feel unsafe, the search for someone to blame becomes powerful. The question is whether migrants are actually the source of the crime crisis, or whether they have become the visible target for deeper problems. This chapter applies the same principle we used in the labor market test: evidence over assumption. If migrants are a primary driver of crime, then areas with large migrant populations should consistently experience higher crime rates because of migrant offending. If migrants disappeared tomorrow, crime should fall dramatically and rapidly. That is the hypothesis we are testing. But crime is rarely caused by a single factor. Criminologists consistently point to a combination of poverty, inequality, youth unemployment, weak policing, organized criminal networks, drug markets, corruption, low conviction rates, and social breakdown. These are structural drivers that exist independently of migration. It is also important to separate perception from reality. Throughout history, minority groups have often been associated with crime during periods of economic stress or political uncertainty. Yet public perception and criminal justice data do not always tell the same story. Another question deserves attention. Who are the victims? In many cases, migrants are not only accused of crime, they are also victims of robbery, extortion, assault, labor exploitation, and xenophobic violence. Understanding crime requires looking at the full picture, not only the most visible narrative. This chapter is not about denying that some migrants commit crimes. Every population contains law-abiding citizens and criminals. The real question is whether migrant status itself is a meaningful explanation for South Africa's crime levels. By the end of this section, We will examine crime statistics, victimization patterns, policing realities, and documented evidence to answer a simple but important question. If every migrant disappeared tomorrow, how much of South Africa's crime problem would actually disappear with them, and how much would remain exactly as it is today? That is the test we are about to run. This slide presents one of the most important findings in the entire experiment, because it directly tests a claim that is repeated so often many people assume it must be true, that migrants are driving South Africa's crime crisis. The first thing to note is that we are no longer dealing with opinion. We are looking at police statistics, victimization surveys, academic research, and human rights investigations. When multiple independent sources point in the same direction, we should pay attention. The evidence reveals a striking pattern. Foreign nationals are often more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators of crime. Consider the basic arithmetic. Foreign nationals represent a relatively small share of South Africa's population. Yet available crime data does not show them committing crime at rates that would explain the country's extraordinarily high levels of violence. In many categories, they are statistically underrepresented relative to their population share. Victimization surveys reveal an even more important reality. Migrants frequently become targets precisely because they are perceived as vulnerable. They may be less likely to report crimes, have fewer social protections, and often operate businesses that can be easily identified and attacked. The discussion around organized crime is equally important. Drug trafficking, gang violence, extortion networks, and organized criminal enterprises are real problems. But these systems are complex, deeply rooted, and often controlled by long-established criminal structures. Blaming migrants for these phenomena risks confusing visible participants with the broader networks that sustain them. Perhaps the most revealing finding concerns extortion. In several documented cases, migrant-owned businesses have been paying protection money to criminal groups. That reverses the common narrative. The issue is not migrants preying on communities. It is often criminals preying on migrants. None of this means that no migrant commits crime. Every population contains offenders. The relevant question is whether migrants explain South Africa's crime crisis. The evidence suggests they do not. The lesson from this test is simple but significant. If migrants disappeared tomorrow, South Africa would still face organized crime, gang activity, corruption, weak policing, low conviction rates, and high levels of violence. The crime problem is real. The explanation commonly offered for it is far less convincing. If the previous slide challenged the claim that migrants cause crime, this slide asks a more important question: what actually does? South Africa's crime crisis is real. The country has one of the highest violent crime rates in the world. The mistake is not recognizing the crisis. The mistake is misdiagnosing its causes. The first driver is the gang economy and organized crime. In areas such as the Cape Flats, criminal networks have been operating for generations. These organizations are deeply embedded in local economies, drug markets, extortion systems, and territorial control structures. They existed long before recent migration debates and continue to operate regardless of migrant presence. The second factor is inequality. South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies on earth. Research consistently shows that extreme inequality is one of the strongest predictors of violent crime. When vast wealth exists alongside extreme poverty, social tension, desperation, and criminal opportunity increase. This relationship appears across countries and across decades. Third, we must confront the policing and justice crisis. Crime thrives when consequences are unlikely. South Africa's low conviction rates, overstretched police services, forensic backlogs, and overwhelmed courts create an environment where many offenders believe they can act with relative impunity. Criminals pay attention to risk. When the likelihood of punishment falls, criminal activity rises. The fourth factor is youth unemployment. Large numbers of young people, particularly young men, face limited economic opportunities and social mobility. Criminologists across the world have identified this demographic profile as one of the strongest predictors of crime risk. The issue is not migration. It is the failure to create pathways into productive economic participation. Notice what these causes have in common. Every one of them is structural. None disappear if migrants leave. Gang networks remain. Inequality remains. Weak policing remains. Youth unemployment remains. That is the key lesson of this slide. Crime is not primarily a migration problem. It is a governance, economic, and social development problem. If we focus on migrants, we may find a convenient target. If we focus on the actual drivers, we may find solutions. The challenge for any society is deciding which path it wants to take. This slide brings the crime test to its conclusion. We have examined the claims, reviewed the evidence, and now we ask the simplest question: if migrants were removed, what would actually change? The answer is striking, much less than public debate often assumes. The first claim is that removing migrants would reduce murder. Yet South African crime statistics consistently show that the overwhelming majority of murders are committed by South African citizens against other South African citizens. Even if every foreign national disappeared overnight, the core drivers of violent crime would remain intact. The second claim is that deportation would dismantle the drug trade. But South Africa's drug economy is not a foreign creation. It is a domestic criminal ecosystem built over decades, involving local gangs, local distribution networks, local corruption, and local demand. Removing a small segment of participants does not remove the structure itself. The third claim concerns robbery. Here the evidence points in the opposite direction. Migrant-owned businesses, particularly small traders and spaza shop operators, are disproportionately targeted by criminals. They are often victims, rather than perpetrators. Removing them may actually reduce economic activity while leaving criminal networks untouched. The fourth claim is that communities would become safer. Yet the areas experiencing the highest levels of violence are typically those struggling with entrenched gang activity, inequality, weak policing, and youth unemployment. These problems existed before migration became a political issue and would continue afterward. The key lesson is not that crime is unimportant. Crime is one of South Africa's most urgent challenges. The lesson is that effective solutions require accurate diagnosis. If we mistake symptoms for causes, we invest energy in actions that produce headlines rather than results. The verdict of the crime test is therefore clear. Deportation is not a crime reduction strategy. At best, it addresses a highly visible target. At worst, it distracts attention from the structural reforms that would actually improve public safety. The uncomfortable conclusion is that the causes of South Africa's crime crisis are overwhelmingly domestic and structural. Real progress comes not from removing migrants, but from addressing gangs, inequality, policing failures, corruption, and economic exclusion. That is where meaningful change begins. We now arrive at the fourth test in our thought experiment. Up to this point, we have examined jobs and crime. Now we ask a different question, one that is rarely discussed in political debates. What disappears when the migrants leave? Notice how the conversation is usually framed. We are told what migrants supposedly take: jobs, houses, opportunities, services. But economies are not one-way systems. Every group that consumes also produces. Every worker, trader, entrepreneur, taxpayer, and customer is part of a larger economic network. This chapter asks us to imagine the morning after a migrant-free South Africa, not as a political slogan, but as an economic reality. What happens to the 30,000-plus migrant-owned spaza shops serving townships every day? What happens to agricultural labor during harvest season? What happens to construction projects, hospital staffing, transport networks, supply chains, wholesale markets, and informal retail ecosystems? Economists call this the problem of hidden contribution. People often notice a worker's presence, but they do not always see the web of economic activity connected to that worker. Remove one part of the system, and the consequences ripple outward in ways that are not immediately obvious. The purpose of this chapter is not to romanticize migration or argue that migration creates no challenges. Every society must manage migration effectively. The purpose is to ask whether removing migrants would solve South Africa's problems or create entirely new ones. This is the test that moves us from politics to economics, from emotion to systems thinking, from slogans to consequences. Because if migrants truly are the cause of South Africa's economic difficulties, their removal should produce visible improvement. But if their removal creates shortages, disruption, business closures, rising prices, and reduced economic activity, then we are no longer looking at a burden. We are looking at an economic contribution that was hidden in plain sight. The question before us is simple. When the migrants leave, what remains, and what disappears with them? This slide takes our thought experiment one step further. Instead of speaking in generalities, we examine specific sectors of the South African economy and ask a practical question. If migrants disappeared overnight, what would vanish with them? Notice that every major sector shown here performs a function that is already under pressure. Informal retail, agriculture, construction, healthcare, domestic services, and logistics are not peripheral activities. They are foundational systems that millions of South Africans rely on every day. Start with informal retail. More than 30,000 migrant-owned spaza shops serve township communities, often operating where formal supermarkets are absent or inaccessible. Remove those businesses, and the impact extends far beyond shop owners. Supply chains, wholesalers, delivery networks, and tens of thousands of South African jobs connected to those businesses are affected. Agriculture tells a similar story. Seasonal labor from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho plays a significant role in harvesting crops across key farming regions. The question is not whether these jobs exist, but whether farms can continue operating at current levels without that labor force. Recent disruptions have shown how quickly harvest losses can accumulate. Construction, healthcare, domestic services, and logistics reveal the same pattern. Migrants are concentrated in sectors experiencing labor shortages, difficult working conditions, or specialized skills gaps. Their contribution is not isolated. It is woven into larger economic systems. The key insight is that economies are networks, not zero-sum competitions. When one group disappears, the result is not an automatic transfer of prosperity to someone else. Often, the first outcome is disruption. That does not mean migration policy is unimportant. It means policy must begin with reality. Before asking who should stay or leave, we must first understand who is building, harvesting, transporting, caring, selling, and sustaining the systems we depend on. Because if these estimates are even partially correct, the economic question is no longer what are migrants taking? It becomes, what would South Africa lose if they were gone? Here we highlight what may be the most immediate and least discussed consequence of our thought experiment: food security. When people talk about removing migrants, they often focus on jobs, crime, or borders. But very few ask a simple question: who feeds the township tomorrow morning? The numbers on this slide reveal an uncomfortable reality. More than 15 million South Africans rely on informal retail networks as a primary source of daily food access. In many townships, the local spaza shop is not merely a convenience store. It is part of the community's survival infrastructure. This reality is rooted in history. Apartheid spatial planning placed many black communities far from commercial centers. While democracy changed political rights, much of that geography remains intact. In many areas, the nearest major supermarket can be 15 to 60 kilometers away. Access requires transport, time, and money that many households simply do not have. This is where the spaza economy becomes critical. Unlike formal retail, spaza shops operate close to where people live. They open early, close late, and often provide services that larger retailers do not. Small quantity purchases, informal credit, and immediate neighborhood access. Now apply the thought experiment. If a large proportion of these shops disappear overnight, who feels the impact first? Not wealthy suburbs, not gated communities. The first people affected are the poorest households, the people with the least transport access, the lowest disposable income, and the fewest alternatives. The key lesson is that food security is not only about producing food. It is about distribution, accessibility, and proximity. A supermarket stocked with food is meaningless if reaching it costs hours of travel and a significant share of a family's income. This is why the thought experiment matters. It forces us to move beyond slogans and examine systems. The question is not whether migration should be managed. The question is whether removing migrants would solve food insecurity or make it dramatically worse for the very communities politicians claim to defend. In this scenario, the first crisis is not economic. It is human. It is the question of who eats tomorrow. Here we reveals one of the most important economic principles in the entire presentation. Economies operate through networks, not isolated individuals. When people discuss migration, they often focus on the visible person, the shopkeeper, the trader, the worker. What they rarely see is the supply chain behind that person. Remove one link, and the consequences travel throughout the entire system. Let's follow the chain from left to right. South African manufacturers and importers produce or bring in goods. Those products move through wholesale networks, regional distributors, and finally into more than 30,000 spaza shops serving township communities. At the end of that chain are over 15 million consumers who depend on it for daily essentials. Now imagine removing a major component of that network overnight. The first consequence is not that local businesses instantly replace it. The first consequence is disruption. Bulk purchasing networks disappear. Distribution routes are interrupted. Thousands of small retailers lose access to affordable stock. Shelves begin to empty. The impact then spreads beyond migrant-owned businesses. South African manufacturers lose customers. Wholesalers lose volume. Drivers, security guards, packers, cleaners, and warehouse workers lose income. The shock moves backward through the economy, just as surely as goods move forward through it. Notice another critical point on this slide. The formal retail sector does not automatically fill the gap. If major supermarket chains have not expanded into many township areas after decades of market opportunity, it is usually because the economics of those locations are difficult. The disappearance of spaza networks does not suddenly change those underlying realities. This is why economists speak about economic ecosystems. A business is rarely just a business. It is connected to suppliers, workers, transport systems, customers, and surrounding enterprises. The lesson is straightforward. When discussing migrant removal, the relevant question is not simply who leaves. The more important question is what systems leave with them. Because if this supply chain breaks, the immediate losers are not migrant entrepreneurs alone. The first casualties are South African workers, South African manufacturers, and township consumers who rely on this network every single day. We have now reached the conclusion of the thought experiment. For 4 chapters, we have tested the central claim behind anti-migrant politics, that removing migrants would solve South Africa's economic and social problems. This slide presents the final balance sheet. Notice what is missing. There is no unemployment miracle. There is no crime collapse. There is no sudden economic revival. Instead, the evidence points in the opposite direction. The sectors most dependent on migrant labor, entrepreneurship, and trade networks experience disruption, contraction, and loss. The largest impacts occur in precisely the areas we have already examined: informal retail, agriculture, construction, healthcare, logistics, and local supply chains. Together, these losses compound into a significant economic shock. Businesses close, production slows, tax revenue falls, and food costs rise. Perhaps the most striking figure on this slide is the unemployment result. After all the disruption, all the removals, all the political promises, unemployment barely changes. Why? Because the structural causes remain untouched. South Africa's unemployment crisis is rooted in deindustrialization, skills mismatches, educational inequality, infrastructure failures, weak investment growth, and the enduring geography of apartheid. None of those problems disappear when migrants do. At the same time, the economy loses productive workers, entrepreneurs, consumers, taxpayers, and business owners. The result is a paradox. A policy sold as economic protection ultimately shrinks economic activity. This is the core lesson of the experiment. Migrants may be visible. They may be politically convenient. They may be easy to blame. But visibility is not causation. If removing a population of nearly 3 million people produces higher prices, lower growth, lost jobs, weaker supply chains, and virtually no improvement in unemployment, then the evidence forces us toward an uncomfortable conclusion. The problem was never primarily the migrants. The problem lies in the deeper structural conditions that existed before migrants arrived, and would remain after they left. That is why serious solutions require governance, investment, education, infrastructure, and economic reform, not scapegoating. The thought experiment ends here, but the policy challenge begins where the slogans stop. We have reached the final test of the thought experiment, and the most important one. Throughout this presentation, we examine the claim that migrants are responsible for South Africa's unemployment, crime, housing shortages, and economic frustrations. We tested that claim against labor market evidence, crime statistics, economic data, and real-world outcomes. The conclusion was consistent. Removing migrants does not solve these problems because migrants are not their root cause. The real drivers are structural. An education system still shaped by the legacy of Bantu education, deindustrialization, infrastructure failures, spatial inequality, corruption, and one of the world's highest levels of inequality. These challenges require governance, investment, planning, and political courage. No deportation campaign can rebuild schools, fix electricity generation, create factories, train skilled workers, or modernize transport systems. This is why scapegoating is attractive. It offers simple answers to complex problems and redirects public frustration away from the structures that actually produce the crisis. But evidence-based leadership works differently. It identifies root causes, accepts responsibility, and pursues real solutions. This chapter moves from diagnosis to prescription, from asking who to blame to asking what must change. Because no society can solve a problem it has misidentified. If South Africa is to reduce unemployment, crime, poverty, and inequality, it must confront their true causes. Only then can the conversation move from outrage to solutions, from slogans to policy, and from division to genuine progress. This slide represents a fundamental shift in the conversation. Up to this point, we have focused on what does not solve unemployment. Now we turn to what the evidence suggests actually does. Notice that every intervention on this slide targets a structural cause rather than a scapegoat. That is because unemployment is ultimately an economic design problem, not a migration problem. The first intervention is industrial policy and localization. South Africa once had a significantly larger manufacturing sector than it does today. Manufacturing creates the kinds of middle-income jobs that absorb large numbers of workers with varying skill levels. Countries that successfully reduced unemployment, from South Korea to China to Vietnam, did so through deliberate industrial expansion, not through anti-migrant campaigns. Second is education and skills reform. An economy cannot create a skilled workforce if the educational pipeline is broken. Technical and vocational education, apprenticeships, and practical skills development are among the fastest ways to connect young people to employment opportunities. Third is energy security. No economy can grow when businesses cannot rely on electricity. Every hour of load shedding destroys productivity, discourages investment, and limits job creation. Solving the energy crisis is not simply an infrastructure issue, it is an employment strategy. Finally, there is spatial justice. Millions of South Africans still live far from economic opportunity because apartheid's geography remains largely intact. Long commutes increase costs, reduce productivity, and make many jobs economically inaccessible. Bringing housing, transport, and employment closer together effectively expands access to work. What connects all four solutions is that they address root causes. They create jobs by expanding economic activity, increasing productivity, attracting investment, and improving access to opportunity. The lesson is simple but important. Unemployment falls when economies produce more, build more, train more, and connect more people to opportunity. It does not fall because a vulnerable group is blamed for problems they did not create. Real solutions are rarely as emotionally satisfying as scapegoating, but they are measurable, evidence-based, and proven to work. If the goal is fewer unemployed South Africans, this is where the conversation must begin. This slide brings us to one of the most important conclusions of the entire presentation. If migrants are not the primary driver of South Africa's crime crisis, then what interventions actually reduce crime? The answer, according to decades of criminology, policing research, and international case studies, is remarkably consistent. Crime falls when states increase certainty of consequences, reduce the pool of high-risk offenders, disrupt criminal enterprises, and build trust between communities and law enforcement. The first priority is improving prosecution and conviction rates. South Africa's challenge is not a shortage of laws. It is the gap between crime committed and crime punished. When offenders believe they are unlikely to be caught or convicted, criminal activity becomes a rational risk. Raising clearance rates through better investigations, forensic capacity, and prosecutorial independence is one of the most effective anti-crime strategies available. Second, we must address youth unemployment. Across the world, the strongest demographic predictor of violent crime is not nationality, but large numbers of unemployed young men with limited economic opportunities. Creating pathways into work, skills training, sport, entrepreneurship, and community programs reduces the conditions in which violence flourishes. Third, crime must be treated as an economic system. South Africa's gang economy is worth billions. Real disruption means targeting finances, supply chains, money flows, and organized leadership structures, not simply arresting low-level participants while criminal networks remain intact. Finally, effective community policing matters. Crime reduction is most successful when police, residents, civil society, schools, businesses, and local leaders work together. Communities solve more crimes when they trust law enforcement and feel invested in public safety. Notice what is absent from this slide: deportations, xenophobia, and scapegoating. Not because migration management is irrelevant, but because the evidence does not identify it as the primary crime solution. The lesson is straightforward. Crime falls when institutions function, opportunities expand, gangs are disrupted, and communities are empowered. Sustainable safety comes from governance and prevention, not from blaming outsiders for problems rooted in domestic realities. If the goal is fewer victims and safer communities, this is where policy attention belongs. Housing is one of the most emotionally powerful issues in South African politics. When families wait years for housing, live in overcrowded settlements, or struggle to access land, frustration is understandable. But good policy requires that we correctly identify the cause of the problem before proposing solutions. This slide presents a critical finding from our thought experiment. South Africa's housing crisis is not primarily a migration crisis. It is a delivery crisis, a corruption crisis, a funding crisis, and a spatial planning crisis. Consider the scale of the challenge. The country faces a housing backlog measured in millions of units. Even if every migrant disappeared tomorrow, the overwhelming majority of that backlog would remain. The numbers simply do not support the claim that migration is the central driver. So what does drive the crisis? First, corruption. Every housing unit lost to fraud, political patronage, irregular allocation, or construction corruption is a home denied to a family. Fixing governance failures can unlock more housing than any anti-migrant campaign. Second, land policy. South African cities generate enormous increases in land value through public infrastructure and urban growth. Yet much of that value is privately captured. Around the world, successful cities redirect part of that increase into affordable housing and public development. Third, funding. The mathematics are unavoidable. A backlog of this scale cannot be solved without sustained investment in social and affordable housing. Housing shortages are ultimately solved by building homes, not by identifying new groups to blame. Finally, there is the issue of spatial reform. Too much development still reproduces the geography inherited from apartheid, placing low-income communities far from jobs, transport, and services. Building more housing on the urban periphery often recreates the very exclusion the country is trying to overcome. The lesson is straightforward. Housing crises are solved through governance, construction, planning, financing, and accountability. Every successful housing program in the world has relied on those tools. If the goal is decent housing for South Africans, then the conversation must move beyond scapegoating and focus on the structural reforms that actually put roofs over people's heads. That is where real solutions are found. One of the strengths of social science is that we do not have to rely on theory alone. We can examine real-world cases where governments attempted large-scale migrant removals and ask a simple question: what actually happened? This slide presents 4 examples from different regions and political systems. While the contexts differ, the pattern is strikingly similar. In Côte d'Ivoire, the doctrine of ivoirité redefined who belonged to the nation, turning millions of migrant workers into political targets. The outcome was economic disruption, social division, and eventually civil conflict. In the United Kingdom, Brexit was partly justified by the promise that jobs held by EU migrants would go to British workers. Instead, healthcare, agriculture, logistics, and hospitality faced severe labor shortages. The jobs did not automatically transfer to local workers. Saudi Arabia's Saudization program sought to replace foreign workers through quotas and mandates. Some substitution occurred, but businesses struggled to fill positions, costs increased, and economic realities proved more complex than political rhetoric. Zimbabwe offers perhaps the starkest warning. Land reform addressed a genuine historical injustice, but agricultural production collapsed faster than replacement systems could be built. The lesson is not that reform is impossible. It is that removing a productive economic group without a viable transition plan carries enormous risks. The broader lesson is clear. Economies are interconnected systems. Workers, entrepreneurs, consumers, suppliers, and investors cannot simply be removed and replaced overnight. None of these examples argue against migration policy or border regulation. Every state has that right. But the evidence consistently shows that mass removals rarely deliver the economic benefits promised by their advocates. History's verdict is sobering. When complex structural problems are blamed on migrants, removing migrants often exposes the real problem rather than solving it. The underlying causes are usually deeper, older, and far more difficult than politicians first claimed. We have reached the end of the thought experiment. This slide is the summary table, the moment where we step back from individual arguments and examine the evidence as a whole. We began with a simple claim: that migrants are responsible for South Africa's major social and economic problems, and that removing them would produce meaningful improvement. Rather than accepting or rejecting that claim emotionally, we tested it across 5 separate areas. The labor market test asked whether deportation would create jobs for South Africans. The evidence showed unemployment is primarily a structural problem driven by skills mismatches, weak investment, and limited job creation, not migrant presence. The crime test asked whether communities would become safer. Crime statistics, victimization surveys, and criminology research pointed to the same conclusion. Migrants are more often victims than drivers of serious crime. The major causes remain gangs, inequality, weak policing, and social exclusion. The food security test produced the most unexpected result. Removing migrants disrupted informal retail networks and reduced food access for millions of low-income township residents. The economic production test examined what happens when migrant workers, entrepreneurs, traders, and consumers disappear. The result was contraction, not growth. Lost businesses, lost jobs, reduced tax revenue, and higher costs. Finally, the structural causes test identified the deeper drivers of South Africa's challenges: deindustrialization, educational inequality, infrastructure failure, spatial apartheid, governance weaknesses, and extreme inequality. The significance of this slide is not that migration presents no challenges. Every country must manage migration responsibly. The significance is that the central political claim fails repeated testing. 5 tests, 5 opportunities for the hypothesis to succeed, 5 negative results. The evidence leads to a clear conclusion. South Africa's problems are real and urgent, but they are not primarily caused by migrants. If the diagnosis is wrong, the prescription will be wrong. Real solutions begin by confronting the actual causes, rather than the most convenient targets. This slide asks the most important question of the entire presentation. What if the political energy spent blaming migrants were redirected towards solving South Africa's actual structural problems? So far, we have explored what happens when migrants disappear. Now we ask a better question. What happens when the real causes are addressed? Imagine a South Africa where load shedding is resolved. Businesses operate reliably, manufacturing expands, investment returns, and economic growth accelerates. The benefits far exceed anything promised by anti-migrant politics. Imagine a functioning skills pipeline. Through serious TVET reform, hundreds of thousands of young people enter the labor market with practical qualifications. Employers recruit locally because the skills exist, and economic expansion replaces labor shortages. Imagine productive land reform that combines ownership, finance, training, and market access. New farmers thrive, food production increases, and rural economies become centers of opportunity rather than exclusion. Imagine housing and transport policies designed to reverse apartheid geography. Families live closer to work, commuting costs fall, and economic opportunity becomes physically accessible to millions. The contrast is clear. Structural solutions create measurable gains. More jobs, higher productivity, stronger growth, better services, and greater social stability. Scapegoating delivers the opposite. It creates division, damages relationships, disrupts economic sectors, and leaves the underlying problems untouched. That is the central lesson of this presentation. South Africa's challenges are real, but every hour spent pursuing a false solution is an hour not spent implementing a real one. The future will not be determined by who can be blamed. It will be determined by what can be built. The real morning after worth imagining is not a country without migrants, but a country that finally confronts the structural barriers holding back its people. This slide captures the central moral and economic lesson of the presentation. Too often, ordinary people are encouraged to see one another as rivals. The unemployed South African is told migrants are the problem, while migrants are encouraged to fear local communities. Yet both groups face many of the same challenges: weak economic growth, limited access to capital, failing infrastructure, inadequate education, and the enduring legacy of apartheid-era exclusion. What if the conflict itself is based on a false premise? The evidence suggests that Somali shopkeepers, Zimbabwean farm workers, Ethiopian entrepreneurs, and unemployed South African youth are not fighting over the same opportunities. More often, they are confronting the same structural barriers. This is where solidarity economics offers an alternative. Instead of asking who to exclude, it asks how communities can cooperate. Township retail partnerships show how local knowledge and community trust can be combined with supply chain expertise and entrepreneurial experience. Cross-community stokvels expand access to capital for people excluded from formal finance. Skills transfer networks turn business knowledge into a shared resource, creating opportunities for more people. Unified worker organizing recognizes that workers gain more by negotiating together than by competing against one another. The larger lesson is simple. Scarcity politics tells people to fight over a shrinking pie. Solidarity economics asks how the pie can be expanded. Ultimately, there are two visions of society. One says your neighbor is your enemy. The other says your neighbor may be your greatest ally. History shows that progress occurs when communities recognize their futures are interconnected. That is the promise and challenge of solidarity economics. We conclude not with a theory, but with a choice. Throughout this presentation, we tested a powerful political claim that migrants are responsible for unemployment, crime, housing shortages, and economic decline. We examined labor market data, crime statistics, economic evidence, comparative case studies, and real-world outcomes. The conclusion was clear. The evidence does not support the claim, but evidence matters only if people use it. First, demand proof. When politicians blame migrants for social problems, ask for data, studies, and measurable outcomes. Narratives weaken when confronted with facts. Second, redirect the conversation. If unemployment is the issue, ask about industrial policy, education, and energy. If housing is the issue, ask about corruption, planning, and delivery. Follow causes, not scapegoats. Third, build solidarity. Division prevents people from recognizing shared interests. Communities are stronger when they cooperate, rather than compete over political narratives. Finally, demand structural solutions. Hold leaders accountable for jobs, electricity, education, infrastructure, housing, and public safety. Ask what they are building, not who they are blaming. The deeper lesson is simple. Democracy works best when citizens reject easy answers to complex problems. Evidence, accountability, and solidarity are forms of civic power. The experiment is complete. The evidence is on the table. What happens next depends on citizens willing to ask better questions, demand better answers, and insist that public policy be guided by reality rather than fear. That is how real problems get solved. We have reached the end of the experiment. Throughout this presentation, we examined a claim that has become central to South Africa's political debate, that migrants are responsible for unemployment, crime, housing shortages, and economic decline. Rather than accepting or rejecting that claim emotionally, we tested it. We asked a simple question. If migrants disappeared tomorrow, what would change? We tested the labor market. We tested crime. We tested food security. We tested economic production. We tested the structural causes behind South Africa's challenges. The results were consistent. Unemployment did not disappear. Crime did not collapse. Housing shortages did not improve. Instead, the evidence pointed to disrupted supply chains, lost businesses, higher food prices, reduced services, and continuing structural inequality. This does not mean South Africa's problems are not real. They are. Unemployment is real. Crime is real. Poverty is real. Infrastructure failure is real. Educational inequality is real. But a real problem does not automatically make a proposed solution correct. That is the central lesson of this experiment. The evidence led us not to migrants, but to deeper forces: deindustrialization, educational failure, infrastructure collapse, corruption, spatial apartheid, inequality, and decades of policy choices. The purpose of this project was never to defend migrants. It was to test a claim. And a claim that repeatedly fails testing must be reconsidered. So the final question is not, who can we blame? It is, who benefits when blame is directed away from the real causes? The experiment is complete. The evidence is on the table. Will we continue fighting the symptoms, or will we confront the systems that produce them? Because South Africa's future will not be determined by who is excluded, but by whether the nation has the courage to solve the problems it has now clearly identified. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.